Reality Case Studies, Season 2, Part 1 of 2, What Postpartum Really Does to the Brain, The Valley, Kristen and Luke, Through the Eyes of a Therapist. Part 1, The Biology of Becoming a Mother. I'm also a mom and a wife. Our son, Taft Buckley, is a thriving 23-year-old young adult who is neurodivergent, living with ADHD and OCD, and he is a self-taught musician who plays by ear. His first instrument was the piano, which he began teaching himself around age 10. He would listen to a song on repeat, sit at the piano, and hit one key after another until he found the sound he was hearing in his head. I would sit next to him for hours while he taught himself how to translate music through his own nervous system. Later, he did the same thing with guitar. I remember him working on Slow Dancing in a Burning Room by John Mayer, and I counted him playing that song more than 100 times in one day because he was determined to perfect it. Today, he plays piano, guitar, drums, lap steel guitar, and bass, and he is a singer, songwriter, and performer pursuing music with the Taft Buckley Band. Before music became his primary path, Taft spent nearly a decade competing as an elite sailor at the national and international level. As a family, we traveled the world with his sailing career, including Palamos, Spain, Lake Garda, Italy, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Belgium. At just 11 years old, he made his first U.S. sailing team in the Optimist class. Watching him move from elite sailing into music has given me a front row seat to neurodivergent development, performance psychology, resilience, motivation, and what can happen when a child's brain is supported rather than misunderstood. His song, Thanks for Stopping By, is on Spotify with more music to come, and I would love for you to follow him and his bandmates. The Taft Buckley Band played Beach Life Festival in both 2025 and 2026. In 2025, Beach Life featured artists including Lenny Kravitz, Sublime, Alanis Morissette, Train, The Pretenders' Jackson Browne, The Beach Boys, and Marcus King. In 2026, the festival lineup included Duran Duran, The Offspring, James Taylor, The Chainsmokers, My Morning Jacket, Slightly Stupid, Sheryl Crow, Ben Harper and the Innocent Criminals, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Group Love, and Peach Pit. I've also been with my husband for over 3 decades, and he too is neurodivergent, living with ADHD and OCD. ADHD and OCD have strong genetic components, and while my husband's and my son's ADHD and OCD present somewhat differently, they are also remarkably alike in many ways. My husband also plays by ear, which has helped me understand on a very personal level how neurodivergent brains can process sound, pattern, repetition, emotion, and creativity in extraordinary ways. I am the neurotypical parent and spouse in our family, and everything I bring to this podcast comes from both my clinical training and my lived experience inside a neurodivergent family system. This series is called Reality Case Studies, real stories, real psychology, real tools for everyday life. My goal is not to gossip about celebrities or to critique reality television. I love reality TV, and I have deep respect for the people who have chosen to share their lives with the world. My goal is to use publicly available stories as teaching moments, as a way to introduce real psychological tools you can use in your own life. Reality television offers something remarkably unique. We watch people make decisions under pressure. We see relationships unfold over years instead of hours. We witness patterns repeat themselves. We observe conflict, repair, avoidance, attachment, anxiety, grief, and family dynamics in real time. As a clinician, those patterns are fascinating because they so often mirror the very same struggles I see every day in my therapy office. When we study a story on the screen and then turn it back toward our own lives, reality television stops being entertainment and becomes a mirror. That is the whole purpose of this series. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something extremely important. Throughout this series, I am not diagnosing anyone. This is a case study, not a diagnosis. I have never met or evaluated anyone featured on the Valley. We study only the observable patterns, and then we turn every one of them back toward ourselves, because that is the step that separates a case study from gossip. In this two-part case study, we're staying with Kristen and Luke from Bravo's The Valley, a couple that clearly loves one another and yet struggled to find one another after the birth of their daughter. Millions of viewers watched and asked, who's right? As a therapist, that was never my question. I found myself asking something entirely different. What was happening inside Kristen's brain, and what was happening inside Luke's? Today, in part 1, we focus on the biology. We're going to explore what postpartum really does to the brain, the body, and the nervous system, because until we understand that, we risk confusing biology with rejection, adaptation with dysfunction, and survival with failure. Next week, in part 2, we'll turn to what happens between them, the psychology of the couple. But everything in part 2 rests on what we learned today. The word postpartum has become almost synonymous with depression in our culture, and I think that has unintentionally narrowed our understanding of what it actually means. Postpartum is not a diagnosis. It is not, in and of itself, an illness. It is a developmental period. It literally means after childbirth. Within that period, a woman may experience joy, grief, awe, anxiety, confidence, uncertainty, fulfillment, loneliness, connection, resentment, gratitude, fear, and profound love, sometimes all before lunch. Those emotional experiences are not necessarily contradictions. They are often evidence of a nervous system attempting to reorganize itself while simultaneously caring for another human being. One of the greatest misconceptions surrounding the postpartum period is that once the baby is born, pregnancy is over. Physically, that is true. Biologically, it is profoundly incomplete. In many respects, childbirth does not conclude pregnancy. It begins recovery. And recovery is not passive. It is one of the most metabolically demanding, hormonally complex, psychologically transformative, and relationally disruptive processes the human body will ever undertake. Yet remarkably few of us are ever taught what that actually means. We devote extraordinary amounts of time preparing couples for labor. We explain contractions. We discuss epidurals. We install car seats with military precision. Then the baby arrives, the world celebrates, and almost overnight the educational conversation comes to an abrupt halt. No one sits beside the couple and says, "Now let me explain what is about to happen to your relationship." No one explains that the mother's brain is entering one of the most extraordinary periods of neuroplasticity observed during adulthood, that the endocrine system is about to undergo one of the most rapid hormonal transitions in human physiology, or that identity itself is undergoing reconstruction. Instead, we often ask a question that is almost impossible to answer honestly. So how are you doing? Which part of her are we asking about? There is no simple answer, because there is no longer one role. There are many. This is precisely where Bowen family systems theory becomes so invaluable. One of the foundational ideas developed by psychiatrist Murray Bowen is that human beings never function in emotional isolation. We function within emotional systems. Every family operates as an interconnected organism. When one member changes, every relationship within that family changes. When anxiety enters one part of the system, it reverberates throughout the entire system. Bowen described a concept called homeostasis, which is one of the most elegant ideas in all of psychology, yet rarely discussed outside graduate training. Homeostasis refers to the innate tendency of biological organisms and relational systems to preserve stability in the face of change. Our bodies regulate temperature, blood pressure, and blood glucose without conscious effort because survival depends on maintaining equilibrium. Bowen proposed that families function remarkably similarly. They develop predictable roles, implicit rules, and methods of managing anxiety that create a sense of stability, even when those patterns are imperfect. The birth of a child fundamentally disrupts that equilibrium. It does not simply add another member to the family. It reorganizes the family's entire emotional architecture. The relationship that existed between Kristen and Luke before the baby no longer exists, not because they love one another less, but because the emotional system they once inhabited has been transformed. This changes the question we ask. Rather than asking, why has Kristen changed, a Bowen clinician might ask, how has the birth of this child reorganized the emotional functioning of this entire family? One question looks for pathology, the other looks for adaptation. This brings us to a concept I believe every parent should understand. Allostatic load. If homeostasis refers to maintaining stability, allostasis refers to achieving stability through physiological adaptation. Pregnancy is perhaps one of the most remarkable examples of allostasis in our lifespan. The mother's body is not trying to remain the same during pregnancy. In fact, it does the exact opposite. Pregnancy requires the body to intentionally redesign the way nearly every major biological system functions in order to support the growth and survival of another human being. The cardiovascular system pumps more blood. The respiratory system adapts to meet increased oxygen demands. Metabolism shifts to provide a continuous supply of nutrients to the developing baby. The immune system performs one of the most remarkable balancing acts in human biology, learning to protect both mother and baby while tolerating a fetus that is genetically distinct from her own body. Even the brain begins reorganizing itself to become more attentive to the needs of an infant. One of the systems working the hardest throughout this process is the endocrine system. Think of the endocrine system as the body's chemical communication network. While the nervous system sends rapid electrical messages through nerves, the endocrine system sends chemical messages through hormones traveling in the bloodstream. These hormones function like highly specialized messengers, delivering instructions to virtually every organ in the body. They tell the uterus to grow, the breast to prepare for milk production, the cardiovascular system to increase blood volume, the metabolism to change how it uses energy, the brain to strengthen maternal attachment, and the immune system to adapt in ways that make pregnancy possible. Without this intricate hormonal communication system, pregnancy simply could not occur. Throughout pregnancy, hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, oxytocin, prolactin, human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, relaxin, and many others are working together like the executive leadership team of a massive construction project. Each hormone has a different assignment, yet all of them must remain in constant communication with one another. If one system changes, the others respond. It is an extraordinary example of biological coordination. Every adaptation requires energy, and every adjustment requires resources. Every biological system that is asked to work harder accumulates wear and tear over time. Physiologists refer to this cumulative biological burden as allostatic load. To understand allostatic load, imagine driving your car up a steep mountain road. The engine is designed to do it. The transmission is designed to do it. The brakes are designed to do it. But driving uphill for hundreds of miles places far more strain on the vehicle than driving across a flat highway. Eventually, the engine becomes hotter. The brakes wear down. The tires experience greater stress, and more fuel is consumed. The car isn't malfunctioning, it is adapting to extraordinary demands. That adaptation simply comes at a physiological cost. The body functions in much the same way. Pregnancy asks every major biological system to operate at a level far beyond its ordinary baseline for months at a time. Then, immediately after childbirth, those same systems must rapidly shift gears again. Hormones that were extraordinarily elevated begin falling. The brain reorganizes once more. Sleep becomes fragmented. The body begins healing damaged tissue while simultaneously producing milk, regulating emotions, responding to an infant's cries, and adjusting to an entirely new family system. This accumulated physiological workload is what scientists mean by allostatic load. The term comes from the concept of allostasis, which means achieving stability through change. In other words, the body maintains life not by staying the same, but by continuously adapting to whatever challenges it encounters. During pregnancy and the postpartum period, those adaptations are occurring on an almost unimaginable scale. When we understand allostatic load, we stop viewing postpartum fatigue, emotional vulnerability, cognitive fog, and reduced resilience as evidence that a woman is not handling it well. Instead, we begin to appreciate them as understandable consequences of a body and brain that have been operating at an extraordinarily high biological demand for many months. Perhaps one of the greatest mistakes our culture makes is expecting a woman to function as though nothing significant has happened. From a physiological perspective, everything has happened. Nearly every major system in her body has been called upon to do one of the most complex jobs in human biology. When we recognize that reality, our expectations become more compassionate, our understanding becomes more accurate, and our support becomes far more meaningful. Consider what Kristen's body has been asked to accomplish over the past year. She constructed another human being. She dramatically increased her blood volume. One of the most remarkable adaptations during pregnancy is that a woman's body doesn't simply make room for a growing baby. It actually manufactures an entirely new circulatory system. By the third trimester, the average woman has increased her blood volume by approximately 30% to 50%, which translates to roughly 1 to 1.5 extra liters of blood. To put that into perspective, that's about 2 to 3 extra bottles of soda circulating through her body every minute of every day. Where does all that blood go? It isn't sitting in one place. It is distributed throughout an entirely expanded biological infrastructure that did not exist before pregnancy. A tremendous amount of that additional blood is traveling through the uterus, which grows from roughly the size of a pear before pregnancy to the size of a watermelon by the end of pregnancy. It is flowing through the placenta, a temporary organ that exists for only one purpose: to exchange oxygen, nutrients, hormones, antibodies, and waste products between mother and baby. At full term, approximately 500 to 750 milliliters of maternal blood passes through the uterus every minute. Think about that for a second. Every single minute, close to 3/4 of a liter of blood is being directed towards supporting the pregnancy. That's roughly 10 to 15% of the mother's entire cardiac output devoted to the uterus alone. The additional blood also supplies the mother's enlarged breasts as they prepare for milk production. It supports the kidneys, which increase their filtration rate by nearly 50% to process both maternal and fetal waste. It helps the skin dissipate heat because pregnancy generates more metabolic activity. It provides a reserve in case significant blood loss occurs during labor and delivery. In other words, the body is not simply making more blood. It is building an entirely temporary life support system. Then something extraordinary happens. Within minutes after delivery, the placenta, the organ that orchestrated much of pregnancy, is no longer needed. Once it is delivered, the body begins dismantling the very infrastructure it spent 9 months constructing. The uterus immediately begins contracting, a process greatly assisted by oxytocin. Those contractions are not only helping the uterus shrink back toward its pre-pregnancy size, they are also compressing the large blood vessels that supplied the placenta. Think of it like shutting down a major highway that no longer needs to carry traffic. Over the next several days, some of the extra fluid that had been circulating in the bloodstream moves back into the body's tissues and is eliminated through increased urination and perspiration. Many women notice that they sweat profusely at night during the first week or two after giving birth. Those night sweats are not random. They are one of the body's ways of eliminating the excess fluid that is no longer needed. The kidneys become incredibly active during this period, filtering and excreting much of that excess fluid through urine. At the same time, plasma volume, the liquid portion of the blood, gradually decreases. Red blood cells are broken down naturally over the following weeks and months, with their iron recycled by the body to produce future blood cells. This process is anything but instantaneous. Although one of the most dramatic hormonal shifts in physiology begins within the first 24 to 48 hours after childbirth, the body is not suddenly back to normal after 2 days. In reality, those first 48 hours simply mark the beginning of a much longer period of biological recalibration. The delivery of the placenta signals the end of pregnancy, but it does not signal the end of adaptation. If anything, it marks the beginning of an entirely new physiological assignment. Throughout pregnancy, the placenta functions as a remarkable temporary endocrine organ. Most people think of the placenta simply as the structure that nourishes the baby, but it is far more sophisticated than that. It serves as a temporary hormonal command center, producing extraordinary amounts of estrogen and progesterone while continuously communicating with virtually every major organ system in the mother's body. These hormones sustain the pregnancy, support fetal development, prepare the breast for lactation, influence the maternal brain, regulate metabolism, alter immune function, and coordinate countless biological processes that make pregnancy possible. Then, within minutes of childbirth, the placenta is delivered. Almost overnight, the body's hormonal landscape changes. Unlike many physiological changes that occur gradually, estrogen and progesterone do not slowly drift downward over the course of weeks. They plummet. Within approximately 24 to 48 hours, both hormones fall dramatically, representing one of the most rapid hormonal withdrawals physiology naturally experiences. Pause for just a moment and appreciate the significance of that. We often hear women casually say, "My hormones were all over the place." It is an extraordinarily accurate biological description of what is occurring inside the body. Imagine the chief executive officers, department heads, and executive leadership team of a multinational corporation all resigning on the same day. The employees are still expected to come to work. The phones still ring. Customers continue arriving. Deadlines remain. Payroll still has to be processed. The business itself has not disappeared. What has changed is the leadership system coordinating the entire organization. That is remarkably similar to what occurs hormonally after childbirth. The body suddenly begins operating under an entirely different hormonal leadership team. Estrogen and progesterone rapidly decline, while oxytocin assumes a more prominent role in promoting maternal bonding, milk letdown, uterine contraction, and heightened responsiveness to the baby's cues. Prolactin increases to support milk production while also influencing energy, emotional availability, and libido. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, continues fluctuating as it responds to sleep deprivation, tissue healing, breastfeeding, infant crying, decision fatigue, and the extraordinary responsibility of caring for a completely dependent newborn. Every major biological system must now learn to function under an entirely different hormonal environment. That transition cannot happen overnight. Hormones, however, are only one part of the story. The body does not simply flip a switch after childbirth. It is carefully dismantling a biological infrastructure that took nearly 10 months to construct while simultaneously building an entirely new one. I often use this analogy when I work with my clients. I compare pregnancy to preparing a city to host the Olympic Games. When a city learns it will welcome millions of visitors from around the world, it doesn't simply build a stadium. It widens highways, it constructs bridges, it expands airports, it upgrades electrical grids and water systems, it creates new transportation routes, it hires thousands of workers, it develops emergency response plans, communication systems, housing, hotels, restaurants, medical facilities, and security infrastructure. Every department within the city begins operating differently because the demands placed upon that city have fundamentally changed. Pregnancy functions in much the same way. The mother's body is not making one isolated adjustment. It is redesigning an entire biological city. Blood volume increases dramatically to support both mother and baby. The heart pumps more blood with every beat. The kidneys filter additional fluid. The lungs adapt to meet increased oxygen demands. The immune system changes its operating procedures so it can protect both mother and fetus while tolerating genetically distinct tissue. The endocrine system rewrites its hormonal priorities. Connective tissue softens to prepare for labor. The gastrointestinal system changes digestion. The breasts become biologically prepared to nourish an infant. Even the architecture of the brain begins remodeling itself, strengthening neural networks involved in attachment, vigilance, emotional attunement, and caregiving. Then the baby is born. Many people unconsciously assume the city simply returns to normal. But cities don't dismantle Olympic infrastructure overnight. The roads remain, the bridges still stand, the transportation systems continue operating. The workers gradually assume new responsibilities. The process is deliberate because dismantling everything simultaneously would create chaos. The postpartum body behaves in remarkably similar ways. It does not abruptly erase pregnancy. Instead, it slowly deconstructs one biological architecture while simultaneously constructing another. The uterus gradually returns toward its pre-pregnancy size. Hormones continue recalibrating. The cardiovascular system slowly adapts to changing circulatory demands. Fluid shifts continue for weeks. The brain refines maternal circuitry through ongoing neuroplasticity. Breast tissue remains metabolically active if breastfeeding. The pelvic floor begins healing. Muscles reorganize. Connective tissues recover. Sleep architecture remains fragmented. The endocrine system continues searching for a new physiological equilibrium while coordinating dozens of competing demands. In other words, pregnancy required the body to become extraordinarily specialized for growing a baby. Postpartum requires the body to become extraordinarily specialized for sustaining one. Those are entirely different biological assignments. This distinction is profoundly important because many couples unknowingly expect recovery to follow a calendar. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. Physiology does not heal according to calendar dates. It heals according to tissue repair, hormonal recalibration, nutritional status, sleep quality, breastfeeding demands, stress, genetics, inflammation, social support, and countless other biological variables that make every postpartum experience unique. Perhaps this is why I become concerned whenever I hear someone say, "She should be back to herself by now." Back to what? The body that existed before pregnancy no longer has the same biological assignment. It has completed one of the most extraordinary feats in physiology and is now reorganizing itself for an entirely new chapter of life. That reorganization is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that the body is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question is not whether the body is changing. The question is whether we have given it the time, the understanding, the compassion, and the support necessary to complete one of the most remarkable rebuilding projects in all of physiology. New security systems, new communication networks, new housing, everything expands to support one extraordinary event. Then, once the event is over, the city doesn't disappear overnight. Roads are closed, and temporary buildings are removed, utilities are rerouted, workers go home, traffic patterns change. The city spends months returning to a new normal. The postpartum body is doing something remarkably similar. It is not simply recovering from childbirth, it is deconstructing one of the most complex temporary biological systems the human body has ever built while simultaneously beginning the next assignment: feeding, protecting, and responding to a newborn. That is why I believe the postpartum period deserves far more respect than it often receives. We are asking a woman's body to tear down one extraordinary biological architecture while immediately beginning another. Very few people appreciate the magnitude of that transition until they understand what the body has actually accomplished. Her immune system learned to tolerate genetically distinct fetal tissue while protecting both mother and baby. Her endocrine system operated at levels that would never occur under ordinary circumstances. Her brain reorganized itself to become exquisitely attuned to the needs of an infant. Then, within hours of childbirth, nearly every one of those systems began recalibrating again. That recalibration is not evidence that something extraordinary has occurred. We often tell women they are recovering from childbirth, and that phrase subtly implies childbirth itself was the primary event. In reality, the postpartum period is the nervous system's attempt to establish an entirely new equilibrium after one of the most comprehensive biological transformations the human body can undergo. Psychologists have increasingly begun using the term matrescence to describe this developmental transition into motherhood. The word intentionally parallels adolescence, not because the experiences are identical, but because both represent profound developmental epochs characterized by hormonal shifts, neuroplasticity, identity reconstruction, emotional variability, and changing relationships. Think about adolescence for a moment. No one expects a 13-year-old to think exactly like an adult. We understand the adolescent brain is under construction. Yet somehow, 6 weeks after childbirth, many women are implicitly expected to have physically healed, emotionally stabilized, resumed intimacy, returned to work, restored their previous appearance, and confidently cared for a newborn while functioning on profoundly fragmented sleep. From a developmental psychology perspective, that expectation is not merely unrealistic, it is developmentally incongruent. It asks the nervous system to complete a process that, by its very nature, requires time. One of the most persistent misconceptions surrounding pregnancy is the belief that the baby is the only one undergoing development. We celebrate the remarkable milestones of fetal growth. Yet while all of that extraordinary biological engineering is taking place, another remarkable process is occurring simultaneously, and it receives remarkably little public attention. The mother's brain is changing. I want to pause there, because I don't think we appreciate the significance of that sentence. The mother's brain is changing, not metaphorically, not simply because she has more responsibilities, literally. Advances in neuroimaging have allowed researchers to observe pregnancy-related changes in the living human brain. Over the last decade, neuroscientists have demonstrated that pregnancy is associated with widespread remodeling of neural networks. Certain regions become more specialized, while patterns of communication between regions become more efficient. These changes are not evidence of damage or decline. They represent one of the most remarkable examples of adult neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize its structure and function in response to significant life experiences. The word neuroplasticity sounds intimidating, but the concept is simple. Neuro means brain. Plasticity refers to the brain's ability to change. For decades, scientists believed the adult brain was largely fixed. We now know that assumption was incorrect. I often ask my clients to imagine a symphony orchestra preparing for a once-in-a-lifetime performance. Before the concert, every musician is talented, but rehearsal changes how they work together. Some instruments become louder, others become quieter. New patterns of communication emerge. Nothing has become less sophisticated. The orchestra has become more specialized. That is what the maternal brain is doing. It is rehearsing for motherhood. Specific neural networks become increasingly attuned to infant facial expressions, vocalizations, body language, smell, touch, and emotional cues. This is one reason a mother may awaken to the faintest change in her baby's breathing while sleeping through sounds that would ordinarily capture her attention. People laugh about this. She can sleep through a thunderstorm but wakes up the second the baby sighs. They assume it's instinct. It is. But instinct is simply biology expressed through the nervous system. Evolution did not reward mothers whose brains ignored those cues. It rewarded mothers whose nervous systems became extraordinarily sensitive to them. The difficulty is that the very biological system designed to protect the infant can become psychologically exhausting when it remains activated continuously. This brings us to hypervigilance, a state in which the nervous system remains persistently alert, continuously scanning the environment for possible threats. In moderate amounts, hypervigilance is adaptive. It allows parents to respond quickly when an infant is in distress. However, when combined with fragmented sleep, hormonal recalibration, previous anxiety, perfectionistic tendencies, or inadequate support, that adaptive vigilance may become overwhelming. This is often where postpartum anxiety begins to emerge. Notice that I did not say the anxiety is irrational. From the brain's perspective, it is entirely rational. The difficulty lies not in the existence of the alarm system, but in its inability to determine when the emergency has ended. Imagine living inside Kristen's nervous system for a single afternoon. The baby stirs. Instantly, her brain begins processing. Was that a hunger cry or a discomfort cry? Did she eat enough last feeding? How many wet diapers today? Was that breathing pattern different? Did I remember the vitamin D drops? Did I sanitize the bottles? Did I eat today? Have I had enough water to support breastfeeding? None of those questions are trivial. Everyone is related directly or indirectly to preserving the life of another human being. That level of cognitive responsibility places extraordinary demands upon the brain, and specifically upon the prefrontal cortex, the brain's chief executive, which has just inherited the largest portfolio of responsibilities it has ever managed. There is a dimension of the postpartum experience discussed far less often than hormones or sleep deprivation, and it may be one of the most psychologically significant. It is grief. That word often catches people off guard because grief is typically associated with death. Yet psychology has long recognized that grief is not limited to the death of a person. Grief is the emotional response to the loss of anything that once formed part of our identity, our assumptions about ourselves, or the way we expected our lives to unfold. Human beings grieve careers, marriages, retirement, and dreams that will never be realized. Grief is not simply about losing someone. It is about losing a version of yourself. Kristen did not simply give birth to her daughter. She simultaneously said goodbye to the woman she had been before becoming a mother. That does not mean she loves her daughter any less. It means she is standing at the intersection of two identities. One is disappearing while another is still under construction. A woman does not simply wake up one morning as a fully integrated mother. She becomes one, and becoming is rarely comfortable. One of the greatest psychological mistakes we make is assuming that gratitude eliminates grief. It does not. Two emotions that appear contradictory can coexist remarkably well within the human mind. A mother can feel overwhelming love for her child while mourning the freedom she once enjoyed. She can be profoundly grateful for her family while desperately missing uninterrupted sleep. Psychologists refer to this capacity as emotional complexity, the ability to experience multiple, seemingly contradictory emotions simultaneously. Emotional maturity is not the absence of contradiction. It is the recognition that the human emotional system can hold joy and sorrow in the same moment. Unfortunately, our culture makes very little room for that complexity. When a new mother says, "I miss my old life," people sometimes hear, "I regret having my baby." Those are not the same statement. When she says, "I don't recognize myself anymore," people reassure her, "You'll bounce back." Bounce back to what? Back to the woman whose body belonged only to herself? Psychologically speaking, that woman no longer exists. And I do not say that with sadness. I say it with respect, because developmental transitions do not return us to who we were. They transform us into someone we have not yet become. Healing is not the process of returning to a previous identity. Healing is the integration of a new one. From a Bowen family systems perspective, identity development is inseparable from relationships. Bowen described one of the central developmental tasks of adulthood as differentiation of self, the ability to maintain a clear sense of one's identity while remaining emotionally connected to the people one loves. A highly differentiated individual can remain thoughtful during emotionally charged situations, tolerate disagreement without losing themselves, and adapt to changing family roles without abandoning their core values. Parenthood tests differentiation in profound ways. In that process, many mothers quietly begin asking a question they are afraid to voice aloud. Where did I go? Notice they are not asking whether they love their baby. They know they do. They are asking something more existential. Who am I becoming? And perhaps that is why conversations like this matter so deeply. Knowledge does not eliminate every challenge of the postpartum period, but it fundamentally changes the questions couples ask. Instead of asking, "Why are you acting this way?" they begin asking, "What is happening inside your brain and body that neither of us has ever been taught to understand?" Meanwhile, Luke is also navigating a profound developmental transition. Although it is essential to acknowledge that the biological demands placed upon Kristen are of an entirely different order. Her body has undergone pregnancy, childbirth, hormonal withdrawal, weight gain, physical recovery, neurological remodeling, and the immediate demands of postpartum caregiving. Although she has now delivered their baby, her body has not simply returned to the body she inhabited before pregnancy. It may carry additional weight, fluid shifts, stretch marks, breast changes, softness in places that once felt different, and a general unfamiliarity that can feel emotionally disorienting. Luke's transition is different, but it is no less significant. He is becoming a father while simultaneously trying to understand a partner who, from his perspective, may suddenly seem unfamiliar. He is renegotiating his role within a family system that has been fundamentally reorganized by the arrival of their daughter. He is adjusting to the redistribution of Kristen's time, attention, physical affection, and emotional energy, all of which are now being directed toward the immediate needs of a completely dependent newborn. At the same time, he is attempting to make sense of emotional reactions that may feel confusing, unpredictable, and at times, painful. He has spoken publicly about feeling as though he could not get anything right, that he was constantly being corrected, and that the emotional climate between them had changed dramatically. Without an understanding of the profound neurobiological and hormonal changes occurring during the postpartum period, it would be easy for any partner to interpret those interactions as personal rejection, criticism, or evidence that the relationship itself had fundamentally changed. The reality is that very few fathers are ever taught what is happening inside the postpartum brain. They are handed a newborn, congratulated on becoming a parent, and expected to intuitively understand one of the most complex biological transitions the human body can experience. Yet no one sits them down and explains what estrogen withdrawal may feel like, why progesterone is rapidly recalibrating, how oxytocin alters attachment and vigilance, why fragmented sleep changes emotional regulation, why executive functioning becomes compromised, or why a mother's nervous system may suddenly become exquisitely sensitive to crying, uncertainty, and perceived threat. Without that framework, many fathers naturally interpret what they can see rather than what they cannot. They see irritability, withdrawal, tears, criticism, emotional volatility, or a diminished interest in physical intimacy. What they do not see is the extraordinary physiological reorganization taking place beneath the surface. I believe this is one of the greatest educational gaps in modern maternal health. Ironically, many new mothers are not taught these processes in any meaningful depth either. They are often given information about labor, delivery, breastfeeding, and infant care, yet comparatively little preparation for what may happen to their own brains, hormones, identity, emotions, relationships, and nervous systems after the baby arrives. I remember having that same experience myself. It was confusing. There were moments when I did not fully understand what was happening inside my own mind and body. And my husband certainly wasn't given a roadmap either. Looking back as a therapist, I realized we weren't lacking love or commitment, we were lacking language. We had never been taught the biology behind the behavior. Yet fathers often experience their own form of grief. Luke may be grieving the effortless companionship that once defined their relationship, the spontaneous affection, the late-night conversations. He may look across the room and think, I miss my partner. Kristen may look back and think, I miss myself. Neither statement invalidates the other. They are grieving different losses while attempting to build the same future. Grief that is not named often disguises itself as anger, as criticism, as withdrawal. Beneath those arguments often lies something far more tender. Two people quietly mourning lives that no longer exist while trying to embrace lives they have not yet learned to inhabit. Perhaps healing begins the moment we stop asking mothers to choose between gratitude and grief. There is a scene involving Kristen that stayed with me long after the episode ended. She and Luke are preparing to travel with their newborn daughter, and what should have been an exciting family trip became a vivid illustration of what happens when an already overtaxed nervous system encounters additional stress. At one point, Kristen finds herself in an airport bathroom experiencing what appears to be a full panic attack, changing her daughter's diaper while being filmed during one of the most intimate and vulnerable moments of early motherhood. Even if you remove the reality television component, let's pause and appreciate what her nervous system is being asked to tolerate. She is in the throes of postpartum. She is traveling with an infant, navigating LAX, one of the busiest airports in the world, managing luggage, the baby's feeding schedules, time pressure, security lines, noise, crowds, and the unpredictability of her surroundings. Now add cameras, production, and the awareness that millions of people may eventually watch one of the most vulnerable periods of her life. Viewers may naturally conclude that Kristen has travel anxiety, of which was documented for years when she was on Vanderpump Rules. I want to emphasize this. A symptom should never be mistaken for the whole clinical picture. It is the nervous system raising its hand and saying, something here needs to be understood. Anxiety, in particular, is often treated as though it is the problem, when in reality, anxiety is one of the brain's oldest survival strategies. Its purpose is not to ruin your day. Its purpose is to anticipate, prepare, scan, and protect. And her anxiety was on high alert. From an evolutionary perspective, anxiety is the mind rehearsing for danger before danger arrives. It asks, what could go wrong? What needs my attention? What must I prepare for? In the right dose, anxiety is adaptive. It helps a mother hear the baby's cry, remember the diaper bag, notice a fever, prepare for travel, and respond quickly when something truly matters. The clinical difficulty begins when that protective system loses precision. The alarm does not only sound for genuine danger, it begins sounding for uncertainty, Stimulation, public scrutiny, lack of control, crowded airports, cameras, crying, fatigue, and the terrifying responsibility of caring for a newborn while being watched. At that point, anxiety is no longer functioning as a wise early warning system. It has become an overextended security department, treating psychological demand as though it were immediate threat. That brings us to the amygdala, which I often describe as the brain's smoke detector. Imagine a home with an extraordinarily sophisticated security system designed to detect smoke, fire, and intruders. When functioning optimally, it protects everyone inside. Now imagine the sensitivity is accidentally turned all the way up. The toast burns, the alarm sounds. Someone opens the door too quickly, the alarm sounds. Steam rises from the shower, the alarm sounds. Nothing about the house has changed. The sensitivity of the detection system has. That is often what anxiety feels like neurologically. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as sensitization, a process through which repeated activation lowers the threshold required to trigger the stress response. The question is no longer, why was she anxious? That question is too small for the physiology involved. The more precise clinical question is, what was her nervous system being asked to process in that moment, and did it have the resources to process it safely? When we frame it that way, the airport, the cameras, the newborn, the body changes, the sleep deprivation, the travel demands, and the public exposure are no longer separate stressors. They become cumulative load on an already recalibrating postpartum brain. In that context, her anxiety is not mysterious. It is intelligible. Her nervous system was responding to an environment saturated with unpredictability, sensory stimulation, responsibility, and exposure. The shift is not from blame to excuse. It is from surface interpretation to physiological understanding. Now consider everything Kristen's nervous system has already experienced: pregnancy, labor, delivery, profound hormonal withdrawal, interrupted sleep, physical recovery, identity reconstruction, constant vigilance, place that already sensitized nervous system into one of the most stimulating environments imaginable, with bright lights, crowds, noise, time pressure, and cameras documenting every response. Throughout those scenes, Kristen appeared to have increasing difficulty recovering once emotionally activated. This introduces another important concept: affect regulation, the nervous system's ability to return to baseline after emotional activation. Imagine dropping a pebble into a lake. The water ripples, and eventually the surface becomes calm again. Healthy nervous systems do exactly that. They become activated when necessary, then gradually return to equilibrium. Under conditions of chronic stress, sleep deprivation, or hormonal change, that return to baseline may take considerably longer. The nervous system becomes activated more quickly, remains activated longer, and requires greater support to recover. That is why two people can encounter the same stressful event, yet experience it completely differently. Neither person is choosing that consciously. Their physiology is different in that moment. This is also an opportunity to discuss cannabis, because many listeners will wonder about it. Cannabis is often described as relaxing, and for some individuals, it may temporarily reduce tension. However, the relationship between cannabis and anxiety is more complicated than popular culture suggests. The primary psychoactive component, THC, affects the brain's endocannabinoid system, a network involved in regulating mood, stress responses, memory, and emotional processing. THC appears to have what researchers call a biphasic effect, meaning the same substance can produce opposite outcomes depending on dose, individual neurobiology, genetics, and environment. Some individuals experience temporary relaxation. Others experience increased anxiety, panic, racing thoughts, and intensified arousal.
That does not mean cannabis causes every episode of anxiety, nor that everyone responds the same way. It does mean that during a period as neurologically and hormonally complex as postpartum, introducing substances that alter perception, arousal, and emotional processing deserves thoughtful discussion with a healthcare professional.
As a therapist, my concern is not whether something provides relief for 30 minutes. My question is different. What is helping the nervous system recover in the long term? Recovery requires restoration. Restorative sleep, stable blood sugar, adequate protein, omega-3 fatty acids, hydration, movement, sunlight, safe relationships, co-regulation, and professional treatment when necessary. These interventions increase the nervous system's capacity rather than simply dampening its awareness. We'll spend much more time on exactly how the postpartum brain heals in a future episode. Finally, imagine watching the person you love experience a panic attack in an airport bathroom. Most partners instinctively want to solve the problem, offer advice, speed things up, keep moving. Yet panic rarely responds to urgency. It responds to safety. One of the greatest gifts a partner can provide during moments of intense anxiety is not a solution. It is co-regulation, the process by which one calm nervous system helps another overwhelmed nervous system gradually return toward stability. Sometimes, the most therapeutic sentence a partner can offer is, "Not you're okay," but rather, "I'm here, we don't have to rush, I'll stay with you until your nervous system catches up." And that idea, co-regulation, is exactly where we'll begin next week, because it is the bridge between the biology we explored today and the relationship we'll explore in part 2. Today we answered the question, what is happening inside Kristen's body? Next week we answer a very different question, what is happening between Kristen and Luke? We'll explore body image and desire, two dysregulated nervous systems trying to love each other, attachment styles, and why control is so often anxiety wearing a different outfit. Now we've arrived at one of my favorite parts of every episode, what I call the path to peace pause. This is the moment where we stop studying the people on the screen and turn the lens back toward ourselves. Because insight about someone else changes very little. Insight about our own patterns is what changes families. So the pause is simply this, a handful of quiet questions, meant not to be answered quickly, but to be carried with you. Before we begin, I want you to notice the first impulse reality television often awakens in us, the impulse to adjudicate. We want to decide who was right, who was wrong, who was selfish, who was insensitive, who should have known better, and who owes the apology. That impulse makes for lively commentary, but it rarely produces meaningful understanding. From a clinical perspective, the question of blame is usually where curiosity ends, not where insight begins. The purpose of this reality case study trademark is not to prosecute Kristen or Luke. It is to slow the story down long enough to examine what each nervous system was attempting to protect, regulate, avoid, or restore. When we understand the science beneath behavior, we stop reducing people to their most dysregulated moments. We stop asking only, what is wrong with them? And begin asking the more clinically useful question, what happened inside them, between them, and around them? And once we can ask that question with enough honesty and restraint, we arrive at the question that matters most. Now that we understand the pattern, how does this family system begin to heal? Before we close, I want you to resist the temptation that reality television encourages in all of us, the temptation to choose a side, because the goal was never to decide who was right. The goal was to understand what each nervous system was trying to accomplish. When we understand the science, we stop asking what is wrong with someone, and we begin asking what happened to them, and then how do we heal together? So I want to leave you with 2 questions. This week's 2 questions Path to peace. Pause. Question 1. When you find yourself emotionally dysregulated, what does your nervous system do to try to create safety? And what problem is it actually trying to solve? Do you become more controlling, withdraw, become critical, go quiet, seek reassurance, or overfunction for everyone else? Path to peace. Pause. Question 2. If the people who know you best described what happens to you under stress, would their description match your own? And what would that gap tell you about your intention versus your impact? Every behavior tells a story. The question is whether we're listening closely enough to hear it. Beneath every emotional reaction, the nervous system is trying to resolve something: uncertainty, fear, shame, loneliness, overwhelm, rejection, or loss of control. Rather than judging your reaction, become curious. Ask yourself, what was my brain trying to accomplish in that moment, and why did that particular strategy feel necessary? If today's episode resonated with you, I have 8 more reflection questions waiting for you inside the companion journal over on Substack. That's where we go even deeper, because insight grows exponentially when you take the time to reflect rather than simply listen. Inside the journal, we'll explore 8 more questions. We unpack each of those together with room to write inside this week's companion journal. You'll find it on my and Patreon and Substack linked in the show notes. This episode is for educational purposes and support. It is not a psychological evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment recommendation for anyone featured, and it is not a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are struggling, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. If you are a new or expecting parent and the themes of postpartum anxiety, depression, or overwhelm feel close to home, you are not alone, and support is available. In the United States, you can call or text the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline at 1-833-TLC-MAMA, 1-833-85-26262, free and confidential, available every day in English and Spanish. If you are ever in crisis, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can reach me and my practice at thepathtopea.com. Next week on Reality Case Studies. In Part 2, we shift from the biology of the mother to the psychology of the couple. We'll explore body image and the psychology of desire after childbirth, what happens when 2 dysregulated nervous systems try to love each other, the amygdala hijack, and the art of repair, how a couple was already practicing parenthood long before the baby arrived, attachment styles and why the same relationship can feel completely different to 2 people, and why control is so often anxiety wearing a different outfit. Everything we learned today about the brain and the nervous system becomes the foundation for understanding what happens between them. Take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, understanding the patterns is the first step. Practicing something healthier is what changes the story. You got this, and I've got you.